I had this moment of clarity, like in those cartoons where a light bulb suddenly lights up over someone's head. I realized that my third child wasn't my biological kid after all. She belonged to another man. I was on the phone with a customer service rep from genealogygurus.com, trying to sort out why my daughter's DNA test hadn't shown up after 10 weeks. I'd given it to her as a special Christmas present and handed over all the tracking numbers needed. After waiting for about 5 minutes, the guy came back on the line and told me the test was processed. But then he said it was a matter of confidentiality between them and the person tested, so he couldn't spill more beans. I said, if you processed it, why isn't it showing on my DNA results? I was pretty eager when I asked. The rep, sounding a bit annoyed, replied, "Sir, there are lots of reasons she might not match your DNA, but I can't talk about this particular test." That's when it hit me, like that light bulb moment, the main reason she's not in my matches is because she's not my biological daughter. I hung up the call, feeling devastated. I remember hitting the red button to end the call and then just breaking down into tears. I woke up a little later, all curled up on the couch in our family room. I still had 15 minutes left of my lunch break, so I decided to call my daughter. She was probably on her break too, since we're in the same time zone. I knew she liked to read a book at her desk while eating, so I figured she wouldn't mind the call. She answered right away, her voice sounding tired. "Hi Daddy, how are you?" I said, "Sweetheart, you know I love and trust you completely, but I found out about the DNA test. I called the genealogy company, and they said it was processed about 2 weeks ago." There was silence, then I heard her take a deep breath. "I know, Dad. We need to talk, but not here, not now. Call me tonight, and make sure Mom isn't around when you do." Driving back to work was like being in a fog, and I'll admit, I wasn't very productive that afternoon at the engineering firm. My mind was racing with thoughts and questions, especially this disturbing idea that my beloved daughter might not be mine. Being the analytical guy I am, I knew I had to sort this out step by step, just like how I handle projects at work. I mean, I'm the VP of engineering for a reason, right? This method was something old man Dwayne taught me when he hired me right out of college to work at his growing company. With Dwayne leading and me at his side, we turned that company into an industry giant, enjoying some pretty good financial success along the way. I had a solid salary, great benefits, and worked with some sharp, funny colleagues. And when I came home each night, my beautiful, charming wife and our 3 amazing kids were there. Over time, the kids grew up, moved out, got married, and had kids of their own. The house felt empty at first, but we found ways to keep busy, and I thought the quiet time was good for our marriage. But reflecting on the last month, I remembered some odd moments, like when Marissa called my wife about 2 weeks ago. It was a Tuesday night, we were in the family room watching TV, and Tracy's phone rang. She looked at the screen, told me it was Marissa, then picked up. Their chat lasted about 5 minutes, with Tracy mostly saying yes or no. I saw tears in her eyes when she hung up. I asked if everything was okay, and she said it was just about Marissa's cat having health issues, acting like it wasn't a big deal, but I could tell she was upset. It seemed strange how much she was taking it to heart. Little did I know, that might have been when Marissa found out the truth. Tracy had no clue about the DNA test I'd sent to Marissa. I didn't think it was worth mentioning. Marissa was the only one of our kids interested in genealogy, so I figured she'd be thrilled about it. I've been digging into my family's history for years, especially enjoying the DNA tests. I thought Marissa would jump at the chance. Clearly, I was wrong. When I got back home, I made sure not to treat Tracy any different, even though my mind was a whirlwind of confusion. I kept telling myself, one problem at a time, one problem at a time. I met Tracy back in my sophomore year at university, but we didn't really connect until my senior year. From then on, it felt like we were inseparable, at least to me. We got married a year after graduation, 31 years ago now, and I'd still say it was the best decision I ever made. At 54, Tracy still looks stunning, and despite having our 3 kids, she keeps up with her exercise and looks like she's in her 30s. She's always been a joy to be around, full of laughs, and until now, I looked forward to spending my life with her. Around 8 p.m., I told Tracy I needed to make a call to the old man about some project we were working on. I excused myself from the room, but really, I went out to the porch swing so Tracy wouldn't overhear anything. I dialed Marissa's number. She answered on the first ring, and her voice was thick with worry. "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have told you sooner, but Mom asked me to wait until she could talk to you," she whispered before I even said hello. "Hey, I'm not mad at you. Take a deep breath," I said, trying to calm her down. "You're not to blame here, you're just caught in this mess like me." I could hear her struggling to breathe, knowing this was tearing her up inside. "This doesn't change anything between us. You're still my daughter, my pumpkin. I've loved you kids all these years, and I'm not stopping now unless you want me to." At that, she completely fell apart, her sobs making it hard to understand her. "I love you, Daddy. I don't need anyone else but you." I told Marissa I didn't want to put her on the spot, but she was my best bet for DNA details. I promised we'd stick to the DNA stuff, so she wouldn't feel like she was betraying anyone. She sighed and then revealed that Amanda Anderson was her half-sister. Stunned, I asked if she meant Amanda, daughter of Uncle George and Aunt Jenny. She confirmed it quietly. I reassured her that she had nothing to apologize for. This revelation meant that Judge George Anderson, whom my kids knew as Uncle George, was Marissa's biological father. This also meant Tracy had been involved with her boss back when he was still an attorney at the law firm, about 25 years ago, since Marissa is 24. Tracy worked as George's administrator back then. George later became a state judge, moved to the capital, and his career skyrocketed. Tracy didn't pursue romance with George, she stayed at Gihao and became the office manager. Over the years, George and Jenny had become such close friends that our kids called them aunt and uncle, and theirs called us the same. During my business trips, Tracy and the kids sometimes stayed at George and Jenny's lake house. I never suspected anything, though the kids mentioned outings with just Aunt Jenny. I guess I missed the signs. I was deep in thought when Marissa's voice snapped me back. I apologized, saying I'd gotten lost in my head, thanked her for her help, and asked her to say hi to Drew, her husband. Marissa then asked what I planned to do next. I admitted I wasn't sure yet, and she cautioned me against doing anything foolish that could land me in jail. I hadn't thought about hurting Tracy until then, but I promised Marissa I wouldn't get arrested, which ruled out violence. I never break promises to my kids. My priorities were clear: calm Marissa down about our relationship, find out who Tracy's accomplice was, and then start divorce proceedings. But first, I'd need a new lawyer, since mine was tied to the firm where Tracy worked. Once I had things sorted with a lawyer, I'd deal with soon-to-be ex-Mrs. Clark Walters. The house felt cold and empty with Tracy there, her talking non-stop, probably out of nervousness. I guess Tracy was really trying to keep me happy, probably thinking it would cushion the blow when I found out the truth. It's tough to say, but there was definitely a distance growing between us, and she wasn't doing anything to close it. About a week later, I met with an attorney, but as soon as he heard Tracy was the office manager at Gihao, he got all nervous. So, I moved on to the next lawyer on my list, a young woman in her 20s who just smiled when I mentioned Tracy's job. That's the kind of lawyer I needed, someone not scared off by Gihao's big shots if they decided to represent Tracy. I told her the little I knew about the cheating, starting with the bombshell that my youngest wasn't my biological child but Judge George Anderson's. Court of Appeals, George Anderson. Marie Robinette, my attorney, asked. I confirmed, watching her closely to see if I needed to find another lawyer. Must be quite a story, she remarked, and we got into the nitty-gritty of finances. With our good jobs, pensions, and benefits, she suggested splitting everything down the middle, keeping half our pensions, and selling the house. This would leave us both financially secure, though I'd be a bit better off with my higher income and pension. Marie added that unless I was after revenge for the cheating, the child, or just feeling disrespected, we could settle this amicably. I told her I didn't want to ruin Tracy financially, despite feeling betrayed. Marie then asked if I wanted to take legal action against the judge, warning it would be more complicated and time-consuming. I might have been a bit sharp when I said the judge was my problem, and I'd handle it my way. She understood and estimated that if Tracy didn't fight it, we could be done in 6 months, if she did, it might drag on over a year. I told her I wasn't in a hurry, just to do it right. With the third task checked off, it was time for the fourth, confrontation. I waited another week, hoping Tracy's conscience might kick in. Saturday night was our usual date night, with a movie and some intimacy, but since finding out about Marissa, I couldn't go through with it. Tracy didn't ask why, another sign she knew I knew, though she was good at acting like everything was fine. But that was about to change. I took her to a fancy French restaurant where we had some wine and desserts. She seemed happier than she'd been in weeks. When we got home, I helped her out of her coat, led her to the kitchen table, pulled out her chair, and said those 4 words, "We need to talk." Tracy gave me a half-smile as I poured myself a Jack Daniels on the rocks and offered her one, which she declined. I looked her in the eye and said, "The floor is yours." Tracy said it had been 20 years since she and George were together, asking if we could chalk it up to a mistake from long ago and move on. I was glad she didn't deny the DNA test's results, but her trying to dismiss it as history seemed like she wasn't taking it seriously. I pushed for details. When did it start? How often? Were Barry and Kathy his too? Tracy clarified that Barry and Kathy were mine. Her thing with George started a year after Kathy was born and lasted 3 years, ending when George left for the judiciary to keep his record clean. After their breakup, there were a few more times at the lake house when Jenny was out with the kids, though initially unaware. Jenny later found out. Tracy mentioned a meeting where she and George promised Jenny no more intimacy. Frustrated, I asked why she never talked to me about it, if I was just a backup to her. She said, wiping her hands on her sleeves, that she knew I'd have divorced her on the spot if she told me, claiming she loved me then and still does. I couldn't resist commenting on her apparent love for George more, pointing out how she started and ended things with him on his terms, leaving me as the backup plan. Tracy protested, desperately claiming she loved me with all her heart. I countered by accusing her of having loved George just as much, sacrificing their relationship for his career while knowing I was her safety net. I noted that while she might have loved me, she knew how much I adored her and depended on our family to deal with his absence. Her gaze dropped to her knees, seemingly admitting this painful truth. Regarding Marissa, Tracy confessed she hadn't thought about the consequences of her affair until the DNA test I'd sent revealed the truth. She assumed that with both her and George having brown hair, brown eyes, and fair skin, no one would question Marissa's paternity. She figured I wouldn't suspect anything since Marissa looked like her, not knowing until the DNA test confirmed it. I exclaimed in disbelief, asking if she was suggesting it was my fault. Tracy explained that she and George had talked about the possibility, but she reassured him not to worry due to the resemblance between him and me. She mentioned George might not have known either, but likely knew now, and she hadn't heard from him since Marissa and Drew's wedding 2 years back. Tracy made it clear that Marissa was still her daughter, listed on the birth certificate, raised by her, loved by her, and she wouldn't stand for George claiming otherwise. If he contacted me, she instructed me to set him straight. I told her I intended to have our other 2 children, Barry and Kathy, tested for DNA as well, explaining I needed to know for my own peace of mind. Tracy pleaded, insisting I knew they were mine and questioning why I couldn't trust her. My response was sharp, my distrust evident, which seemed to shock her. She was also worried about me telling our other children about her affair, not wanting to be seen as unfaithful by them. Changing the topic, I asked for more details about her affair, how often, where else they met. Tracy explained it wasn't planned, it grew from their work friendship into something more. She described George as kind, thoughtful, witty, funny, and passionate, saying they had a connection because they both loved their spouses. They kept their meetings discreet, usually out of town, never at our home since that would have been wrong on many levels. She whispered that they hadn't been intimate since their affair ended. When I asked if Jenny knew and had forgiven them, Tracy confirmed, reiterating she had told me before. I whispered, my voice uncertain, that I didn't think we could go back to how things were. Tracy tried to reassure me, admitting their actions were wrong but stressing it was over 20 years ago, and I hadn't had to live through it. She begged for us to return to our life from a few weeks back, where I was her loving husband, and she my loving wife, insisting nothing had to change. I told her firmly that things had already changed. I shared that for the past 3 weeks, I'd been wondering what I did wrong for her to fall for another man, questioning if I could ever trust her again enough to stay married. I expressed with deep emotion that I had given her my heart completely, yet she treated it like something to use at her convenience. I emphasized our marriage was supposed to be about unwavering love, not convenience. At this, Tracy began to cry. Normally, I would comfort her, but this time felt different. I retreated to the family room, turned on the TV, and left her alone at the kitchen table. That night, we shared the bed, but for the first time in a while, we didn't cuddle. I moved as far to the edge of our double bed as I could, refusing to let Tracy snuggle up to me when she got in. Her face was a mix of surprise and hurt, but I didn't care. On Sunday morning, while Tracy made a nice breakfast, I brought up divorce over our meal. She practically yelled, arguing that the affair was over 20 years ago, I hadn't known about it, and we should just move forward. I shouted back, stressing that a mistake is still a mistake, no matter how old. I voiced my feelings of betrayal, how she had deceived and cheated on me, breaking my trust. These weren't just temporary issues. Unable to continue, I left the table, my plate half-eaten, and went outside to mow the lawn. That was the last conversation I had with Tracy until Wednesday afternoon when she told me Jenny Anderson would be joining us next weekend. I wasn't thrilled, but Jenny was an old, dear friend who'd gone through a similar ordeal, so I figured it was worth talking to her. At 6 p.m. on Friday, Jenny arrived, having driven 2 hours from her place. Surprisingly, she didn't bring George. Dinner was light and friendly, but afterward in the family room with wine, we got to the main topic. Jenny spoke about the affair like it was ancient history, calm and detached at first. But as she went on, her emotions grew, tears forming in both her and Tracy's eyes. Jenny explained that when George confessed, she thought it had ended long ago, and he promised it wouldn't happen again. She was devastated at first but realized, since it was over before she knew, it hadn't hurt her as much as it could have. Knowing Jenny wasn't after George's money, I could see how she might view things differently. George's charm is undeniable, isn't it? Although I only learned about Marissa recently, just like everyone else, I understood and apologized for that, Clark. Jenny never mentioned the few times Tracy and George met after their affair, especially at their lake house. I wondered if they'd told her about those, but I didn't ask. It made me think George must be a hell of a lawyer because Jenny seemed more apologetic for him than upset. Unfortunately for Tracy, I'm not as calm as Jenny, nor swayed by her eloquence, so I wasn't about to let Tracy and George off the hook like Jenny did, even if their affair was 20 years old. I often think about what my life would be if I left him, and how it would impact me and the girls, Jenny continued. You should always consider if your life would be better or worse without your spouse. For me, I think it would be worse. Thanks for sharing your take, Jenny, I said. It gives me a lot to think about, and I'll need to mull it over. There are a lot of factors, including that I wasn't told about the affair, I stumbled upon it by accident. Tracy knew it was wrong when she was with George, anticipated my reaction, and thought it best for everyone if I never found out, living in ignorance. That would have been the case without that DNA test. Now, 20 years later, I find out the love of my life had an intimate relationship with another man before coming back to me. During Jenny's story, Tracy was silent, just listening. She didn't know I saw her looking at me, so I sat casually, slightly annoying her. My response to Jenny's story wasn't what Tracy or Jenny had hoped for. They exchanged sad looks, realizing I wasn't responding as expected. I shook my head, went to the kitchen for another glass of wine, returned, and turned on the TV, signaling the conversation was over. The ladies got the hint and moved to the living room, where I could hear their quiet chatter. After finishing my show, I turned off the TV, poked my head into the living room to say goodnight, and went upstairs to our bedroom. On Saturday, Jenny cornered me in the family room, saying we needed to talk. I didn't know where Tracy was, but I agreed to talk with Jenny and we moved to the formal living room, settling into chairs in the corner. Jenny started by acknowledging my pain but argued that not forgiving Tracy and divorcing her would be a huge mistake for both of us. She emphasized that our love should be what matters most and that the past should stay in the past. She pointed out how tragic it would be for us to live our remaining years apart because of something that happened 20 years ago. She said if she could forgive George, surely I could forgive Tracy. I was honest with Jenny, saying I didn't know if I could forgive Tracy. I reminded her that unlike her situation where she was informed about the affair, Tracy never told me. I argued that Tracy knew it was wrong and that I wouldn't have forgiven her back then, so why should I now? I highlighted the gravity of her deception. Not only had she cheated for years, but she also deceived me for 2 more decades. I expressed my struggle with forgiveness and questioned how I could ever trust her again. Shaking my head, I got up and left the room, passing Tracy in the hallway. She could see from my face that I wasn't budging. Saturday night's dinner was uncomfortably quiet. The women tried to make small talk, but I wasn't in the mood, barely speaking 3 words. After a brief thank you, I grabbed my jacket and left, saying I'd be at Malone's, my go-to spot for a quiet drink. At Malone's, feeling down, I chose a table instead of my usual spot at the bar. The owner, who's like a sister to me, urged me to open up. I told her Tracy had cheated and our youngest might not be mine. She was furious on my behalf, offering her no-nonsense perspective which I appreciated. She asked if Tracy had apologized for the affair or just for getting caught, and I realized Tracy hadn't really apologized. She gave me free drinks and arranged a cab, taking my keys for safety. I got home around 2 a.m., and Tracy was at the door, helping me up to our bedroom. I collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, and she took off my shoes and socks. That's how I slept. Late Wednesday night, my son called me at the office, wanting to discuss Tracy's situation. It seemed Tracy had involved our kids to try to sway me against divorce. My son Barry and I usually agreed on things, but it was clear he was siding with Tracy. I firmly explained to him that what Tracy did initially might have been a mistake, but continuing for months made it a choice. I asked how he'd feel if his wife Linda cheated, even if it was years ago. The deceit and disrespect remained. I felt Barry should have stayed out of it. He was taking sides in something he shouldn't. I was frustrated, feeling betrayed after idolizing my wife only to find out she kept this secret. If not for that DNA test, I'd still be in the dark, feeling like I was just a backup plan. As Barry argued I was overreacting, I hung up, seeing no point in continuing the conversation. When I got home around 6 p.m., Tracy was making dinner. She didn't look happy when I said I wasn't hungry. I poured myself some Jack, turned on the TV, and sat in my favorite chair. She came in, asking what was wrong. Same old stuff, different day, I said. My wife cheats on me for 4 years, has a kid with another guy, and now my kids are making me out to be the bad guy. Do me a favor, call Kathy tonight and tell her not to call me tomorrow unless she wants to be hung up on like Barry. Tracy lowered her eyes. You'd think after 31 years, she'd know not to push me on this, I said, raising my voice. Not only did you cheat for 4 years and have a child with another man, but you also replaced me in your heart with him. You can sit here and tell me you weren't in love with him and that if he asked you to divorce me for him, you wouldn't have done it. The truth is, you might love me, but you're not in love with me, you're in love with him. I'm just a dependable backup because you've always known my heart belongs to you, and I'd do anything to keep you. You cheated, lied, disrespected me, and now you try to turn our kids against me. That's the final straw, Tracy. But I won't be vengeful, especially not to Jenny, and I won't ruin George's career. I'm going to file for divorce citing irreconcilable differences, we'll each keep our retirement, and we'll split everything else, including the house, right down the middle. As tears streamed down Tracy's cheeks, she rose from her chair. I couldn't resist one more jab. You never mentioned regretting your affair, probably because you don't regret it. The only thing you regret is that I found out, isn't it? The rest of the night was spent in the company of a bottle of Jack Daniels. The next day, I contacted my attorney, telling her to prepare the divorce papers as quickly as possible. She said I could review them on Tuesday, and they'd be ready for Wednesday, with Tracy to be served on Thursday, but I insisted they come to my house on Friday night. I wanted to be there when she got the papers. Next, I called Judge George Anderson's office, telling his receptionist I needed him to call me back about an important matter. He knew why I was calling and called back a couple of hours later, sounding uneasy. He knew what I was getting at but didn't want to deal with it at his office. I agreed and told him I'd be at his house the following Saturday at 10 a.m. He didn't know Tracy would be served the night before, but I was sure he'd find out before I made the 2-hour drive to his fancy place. At dinner at Malone's on Saturday night, Tracy mentioned Jenny had called, telling her about my upcoming meeting with George. Tracy asked if she should come with me. I told her no, this wasn't just a casual chat. George and I had serious issues to discuss, and her being there wasn't necessary. I reminded her he was an appellate court judge with a spotless reputation, potentially in line for a Supreme Court position. Any aggressive behavior could have legal repercussions. Plus, she had promised not to do anything that would hurt his career. Tracy responded with a hint of jealousy, but I reassured her I'd keep my promise not to jeopardize George's prospects. After talking to the senior guy at the office, I took some personal hours to meet with my attorney and review the divorce papers. I gave her the go-ahead. As I was leaving, she asked if I had plans about George. Confused, I asked why she was concerned. She said because she still handled some criminal cases and thought I might need a good lawyer since engineers might not get emotional, but our methodical approach can be intimidating. She handed me her card, and I left her office. The next 3 days flew by with a big project at work, which helped distract me from my personal life. Even the old man commented on my focus despite the chaos I was going through. I told him it was a relief at least one thing was going smoothly. On Friday evening, before leaving, I confided in him about Tracy being served and my meeting with George, warning him that if things went south, I might be in jail by Monday. He assured me of his support and promised to provide bail if needed. We parted with a firm handshake. Coming home, the smell of another delicious meal Tracy was preparing greeted me. She'd been really showing off her cooking skills lately, and I had to admit, she was excellent. Despite the tension at our meals, I made sure to thank her for the dinner. I wasn't going to be ungrateful. After dinner, as we were about to watch TV in the family room, the doorbell rang around 7 o'clock. I had a feeling it wasn't for me, so I stayed seated. Tracy looked at me and went to answer it. She opened the door to a well-dressed young man who asked if she was Tracy Walters. Confirming, she received a manila envelope from him with the words, "You have been served," before he quickly left. Tracy stood there, motionless, her shoulders slumping and tears forming. I walked past her, closed the door, then gently led her to the kitchen table. She looked devastated, just as I'd expected. We sat in silence for what felt like forever but was only about 5 minutes. Finally, she muttered, "You asshole," and rushed upstairs to our bedroom. I chose not to follow. That night, for one of the few times since we'd married, I didn't sleep in our bed but went to the guest room, though calling it sleep would be an overstatement. I had considered Tracy the love of my life, my soulmate, my everything until just a few weeks ago, and she was still sharing a bed with me despite everything that had happened. I guess neither of us wanted to be the first to make a move, but now, in my mind at least, it was all over. The next morning, I got up, took a shower, and dressed quietly, making sure not to disturb Tracy or provoke any confrontation. I didn't check if she was awake, I just gathered my things and left. My outfit was my usual, a collared shirt, a decent pair of Levi's jeans, and those custom-made cowboy boots with metal tips I'd picked up when visiting our son in Dallas. I left earlier than needed to ensure I wouldn't be late for the meeting with George, figuring I could kill some time at a cafe if necessary. I arrived at George and Jenny's house right at 10 o'clock and rang the doorbell. Jenny, looking lovely but clearly nervous, opened the door. All I could say was, "I'm sorry it had to end like this." She hugged me without a word, took my hand, and led me into the room where George had all his memorabilia and pictures. George was in his favorite chair but stood up when we entered. Jenny, looking quite apprehensive, left the room. We stood about 6 feet apart, sizing each other up. There was a time when I thought of this man almost like an older brother, we were that close. George was 2 years older than me, about the same height, but the comforts of the last 20 years had added about 30 pounds, mostly around his belly. We had shared hopes, dreams, adventures, gone fishing and hunting together. I used to be proud to call him my friend and proud of his career as a judge, but now, with his gaze no longer friendly but adversarial, I felt a surge of anger. "You've got my wife's heart, you asshole," I yelled. "You get to keep your clean image because I promised Tracy I wouldn't tell anyone, and I don't break promises to her. But you won't keep your manhood." With that, I took a big step forward, planted my right foot, and delivered a powerful upward kick with my left, aiming for his groin. George was slower than I expected, and my boot, with its metal tip, hit the mark. I felt the impact and heard him howl in agony as he crumpled to the floor, clutching himself and crying out like a wounded animal. All my rage and frustration boiled over. Jenny rushed back in, seeing George in pain on the floor, trying to comfort him, but his screams only grew louder. She looked at me with fear in her eyes. I pulled out my phone, dialed 911, and calmly said, "There's been an accident at Judge George Anderson's house, we need an ambulance." I turned to leave, but Jenny grabbed my arm. Instead of panic or anger, there was a strange calm on her face. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you. We're clear on what needs to be done." I hugged her back, left the house, got in my car, and drove home, confident the police wouldn't come after me. Jenny would explain things to George when he could think straight. The drive home was a mix of relief and a gut punch. After months of heartache, I finally felt unburdened. Realizing Tracy's betrayal had loosened her hold on my heart, allowing me to think clearly and do what was best for me. It might not have been the right choice for everyone, but sometimes, you've got to look out for yourself. That's what everyone else had done for the last 2 decades, so why not me? Sure, a part of me would always love Tracy, but I wasn't going to dwell on this chapter anymore. It wasn't my fault or my choice, it was time to move forward. Once home, I went to the basement, grabbed a couple of suitcases, and headed to our bedroom. Tracy followed me from the family room, asking, "That's it then?" "That's it," I replied, 31 years and out the door, Tracy. "It's a shame you're so wrapped up in yourself that you can't see how you deceived me, how you stole 24 years of my love through deception. But I've moved past it, and I don't hate you. I don't even hate George, though he probably thinks I do now. I'll mend things with Barry and Kathy later, you should make peace with Marissa as soon as you can. Those girls are missing out. Sign the papers, Tracy, and let's put this behind us." I continued, "I'll have the rest of my things out in a few days. We don't need to talk anymore. If you have anything to say to me." I left my lawyer's business card on the kitchen table. Tracy stood there in shock, tears welling up, but she didn't say a word. I grabbed my suitcases, went back downstairs, and stashed them in my car trunk. After returning to the house, I packed up my belongings and left. 31 years, just like that. The end. Well, I lied. Turns out George managed to save one of his testicles after all, but it took extensive surgery and months of pain. I heard it from Marissa, who Jenny had contacted trying to reach me since Jenny didn't have my number, and the rest of the family had no interest in informing me. In fact, they haven't spoken to me for 8 months now, but I've made peace with it. According to the official story, Judge George had an accident in his office, falling onto the corner of his fancy desk, taking a nasty tumble twice, ending up on the floor. The media downplayed it as a domestic accident, not mentioning the specifics of his injury. Surprisingly, he got a lot of sympathetic coverage, and it seems this won't hurt his chances of making the Supreme Court shortlist. Tracy signed the divorce papers within a week, and last week, our divorce was officially finalized. The house will be auctioned off. Tracy hasn't tried to contact me since I left, nor have Barry or Kathy. It looks like I won't be at the family Christmas dinner, wherever that might be. The old man is handing over the company to me in the new year when he retires. As per our agreement, I'll run the company for 7 years before I can retire comfortably with a significant golden parachute. After that, he plans to sell the company, and I'll get a 10% cut from that deal too. I've started dating again after being married for what felt like forever. It'll take some time to get used to how all that works. Interestingly, news of my divorce spread fast, and quite a few divorced friends reached out, showing interest. Even a couple of Tracy's divorced friends called, surprised she let me go. I must admit, it's been a nice ego boost. I see a promising life ahead, filled with both professional and personal challenges. In my free time, I'm exploring new hobbies. One thing I've given up on is genealogy. I used to be into it, but it's no longer a pursuit of mine.